It was Halloween night and the friends had gathered at Marcus' apartment to have dinner, chat, and have a bit of a scare. They were on the 8th floor, and the wind was making the window shake strongly. Louise approached the window and looked out. "I think tonight is ideal to play the cup game." The others immediately agreed, except Carmen, who suddenly turned pale and threatened to leave if they insisted on playing this game. Her nervousness was so evident that the other young people ended the proposal and began to think of some other terrifying pastime. However, Marcus was left wanting and asked her why she felt so much rejection for a simple game. "It is not a simple game," Carmen answered, still nervous. And then she began to tell them a story that left them stunned. She said that about 2 years ago, she had done it with some friends. She didn't know what it was about, and one of the girls explained the rules to everyone. The cup game was a simplified variant of Ouija. Without a board, where a cup was placed upside down on a table, and then the participants rested their little fingers on it. This supposedly created an invisible force that attracted all types of spirits. It was said that when you began to play, things around you began to move. The candles went out, and the cup began to slide uncontrollably on the surface of the table. Carmen thought it was nonsense and laughed amused. But her smile suddenly faded when the game started and she saw the fluorescent lights overhead flickering. She looked at her friends. There were 5 of them in total. And they all had their eyes closed and didn't seem to realize what was happening. Carmen thought they were playing a practical joke on her, and she laughed nervously, determined not to be intimidated. Suddenly, she felt someone behind her push her, and one of her friends, who was on her right, with a voice that didn't sound human, said, "Don't make fun of the dead, Carmen." The young woman looked back, but there was no one there. She felt the skin on her arms stand on end and had a horrible intuition. There was someone under the table. She didn't dare lift the tablecloth to look, but she could almost feel the presence of that entity. She felt it very close to her legs, as if it were crouched. She tried to separate her finger from the glass and get up, but she couldn't do either. It seemed that her finger had stuck to the glass, which was now moving violently back and forth on the table. "Girls, let's get this over with," she said with a trembling voice, but none of her friends opened their eyes. They seemed to be in a deep trance. "Girls," Carmen repeated, trying to raise her voice. "I'm telling you that..." Then she screamed. The faces of her friends had transformed. They were no longer 16-year-old teenagers, but rather old women who seemed to have been dead for a long time. The old women opened their eyes at the same time and in a horrible and perfectly synchronized chorus told her, "You opened a portal to another world, which will soon close, but you will always have the key." Finally, Carmen was able to free herself from her paralysis and ran out of the house. When she saw her friends again the next day at school, they were still the same as always and didn't seem to remember anything. All her friends had been horrified and silent after hearing her story. Marcus reacted surprised. "Whoa, now it's Halloween! You've made my hair stand on end. Hey, what do you think they meant when they said you'll always have the key?" Carmen shrugged her shoulders. She told him that she didn't know, but just in case she always stayed away from that type of spiritualism games. Marcus agreed with her. If something like that had happened to him, he wouldn't want to play again either. The wind continued to blow strongly, and the young man got up again to see if the windows were closed properly. But when he did, his body trembled, there in the reflection of the glass. Carmen's face was that of an old woman who smiled at him with deep malice. What do you think of the story? Don't leave, we still have more terror. Tradition has it that years ago, in certain hospitals in the United States, they used black bracelets to record the time and cause of death of patients. If you found someone covered up, carrying one of those bracelets on a stretcher, you knew you were next to a corpse. Eric was a medical trainee at a hospital in North Dakota. His passion and dedication to saving lives were what kept him going during grueling shifts of up to 36 hours, leaving him exhausted. Last night had been particularly hard. The emergency room hadn't had a break, and he found himself for the first time caring for a patient without the support of another doctor. He fought for more than 2 hours for the life of the young woman, who was no older than 22. But her case was considered lost from the moment she was admitted, and the hospital chose to prioritize other patients with a better chance of survival. The injuries the young woman had suffered in a traffic accident were so serious that even if Eric had worked a miracle and saved her, the aftermath would have been devastating. The hospital's most experienced doctors had intervened on others injured in the accident, leaving Eric with the challenge of understanding the harshness of his profession. Despite the loss of that patient, they saved 3 lives in the worst traffic accident recorded in the region in months. The young doctor knew that the girl had probably never had a chance to survive, but his insights were devastated. Despite this, he sadly placed a black bracelet on the deceased. Although nurses normally took care of this task before sending the deceased to the morgue, Eric chose to do it personally so that the experience of his first death would serve as a lesson and motivation in one of the toughest professions. He memorized every feature of the young woman and covered her with a sheet before an orderly carried her in a stretcher down a long hallway to the mortuary. By the end of his shift, he looked like a ghost. His face haggard with exhaustion, and the emotional shock of not saving the girl had left him exhausted. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed death on an operating table, but this was the first time he was the doctor in charge and felt completely responsible. He went over every move in his mind, looking for mistakes or actions he might have overlooked, but he knew he had done his best. Sometimes fate was simply unforgiving. With his eyes lowered and almost in a state of drowsiness, he entered the elevator toward the 7th floor, where he kept his clothes. The only thing he wanted at that moment was to change and go home to rest. It was 4 in the morning and the hospital seemed desolate. Eric was so deep in thought that he barely noticed anyone was inside the elevator when he entered. A woman of about 60 greeted him with sympathy. "Wow, I thought I looked bad. What happened to you?" Eric turned and saw the lady, who was also pale and exhausted. Although he didn't feel much like talking, he responded, "Today has been an extremely difficult day. I don't know how I'm still standing. I lost my first patient," he said with a gesture that indicated he was on the verge of tears. The woman gave him words of encouragement and assured him that as a professional, he had done everything in his power. That profession brought as many joys as it did sorrows. She advised him not to be so hard on himself. Eric thanked her for her words and told her that surely the next day, after resting, he would see everything differently. Suddenly, the elevator door opened on a floor that neither of them had selected. Looking out, he saw the silhouette of a young woman in the hallway, who slowly turned towards them. Eric, upon seeing the girl's face, stepped back abruptly and leaned against the elevator wall, pointing at the young woman and trying to say something but unable to articulate a word. Then, as if regaining control of his body, he rushed towards the elevator panel, repeatedly pressing the door close button. The woman inside the elevator looked at him in bewilderment as the doors closed a few centimeters from the young woman who was approaching. "I saw that girl," Eric said, stuttering with shock. "I saw her die. I couldn't do anything to save her, and I put a black bracelet on her." The woman, who had been standing by the elevator wall, smiled as she raised her arm and asked, "Do you mean a bracelet like this?" He turned to look at her and saw that on her wrist she was wearing a black bracelet identical to the one used in the hospital. The young doctor fainted from fright, briefly grabbing the woman's arm as he fell to the floor of the elevator. Minutes later, they found him still passed out on the ground. Everyone attributed his collapse to exhaustion, but he knew that what he had experienced was real. He had in his hand a black bracelet that he had accidentally torn off the woman's arm before he passed out. Upon examining it, he was able to confirm that the woman had died 2 years earlier in a traffic accident, very similar to that of the young woman he tried to save. Don't change the video yet, Tiktakers. This hasn't come to the end. That day, the teacher appeared in the classroom introducing a new student. His name was Marcus. Javier, the most popular boy in the class, soon laughed and made the entire class burst into laughter when he saw that his new classmate was hugging a Barbie doll. "How old are you? Are you still a baby?" he shouted out loud, making Marcus look ridiculous. The whole class laughed at the comment, and the teacher told them to remain silent, asking them to try to make their new classmate feel comfortable. Marcus sat at the desk that was right in front of Javier's, holding his backpack on the chair and leaving his doll sticking out of the zipper. That Barbie seemed to be looking at the young man with her big, expressive blue eyes. She smiled like all dolls, but that smile seemed malicious. While Javier attended class, he heard laughter from time to time. He looked everywhere, but his classmates seemed silent, following the teacher's lesson. Soon the bell rang and everyone went out to recess. The new student was sitting under a tree alone, holding his doll and watching the others play. That was a place where Javier and his friends sat at recess, so he approached him and told him to get up and leave. But the young man didn't move. He looked motionless into his eyes without making the slightest movement. That pissed off Javier, who, seeing how his authority was being flouted, ripped the doll out of his hands and threw it to the other side of the patio. "Come on, run and go pick up your little doll. You're not going to cry, right?" Far from letting a tear fall, he got up, and as he passed by the bully, he whispered in his ear, "Let's see who's going to cry." Suddenly, a sharp pain in his stomach made Javier writhe on the floor. Something had felt wrong. While he was trying to get up with the help of his friends, he could see the new student pick up his Barbie. Despite the distance, he could notice how the plastic eyes rested on him. Would that doll have any power? That thought was absurd. That night, he lay in bed thinking about what had happened at school. When he fell asleep, he saw Barbie's face with her big eyes and creepy smile. There were also the children he made fun of daily. Then Marcus said to him, "Your worst day has come." All of a sudden, the alarm clock rang and Javier woke up, drenched in sweat. That was his big day, the day of the class representative elections. He already had his speech prepared. He was going to show the new students and the other children who was the boss, and that no one would stand in his way to continue being the most popular in class. When he arrived at school, he realized that the new boy was not there. He was glad and wished that he would never appear again. The principal announced over the loudspeaker that all the students should go to the assembly hall to begin the delegate elections. Javier walked there with an air of grandeur. The room was full with all the children from the school. Finally, the time came to defend his candidacy. He checked himself in the mirror and blew a kiss to himself. He stood in front of the microphone and looked at the entire audience. Everyone was silent. And suddenly, laughter. Why were they laughing? The laughter was getting louder. Javier hadn't started. He hadn't even told a joke. Even the teacher laughed. What was happening? Suddenly in the front row, he saw the new student smiling while holding his Barbie. The doll was now wearing a suit, the exact same suit that Javier was wearing. He looked down in horror. He realized he was in his underwear, standing in front of the entire school. The laughter became even louder when he tried to run off the stage and stumbled. The malicious look of the Barbie in Marcus' hands seemed to burn with satisfaction as she watched the scene. The pain in Javier's stomach returned, and he began to writhe in agony on the floor. The young man's desperate attempts to comfort himself only caused even more intense laughter. His friends, who used to follow him as if he were a leader, were now mocking him mercilessly. The new boy, Marcus, approached slowly, holding the doll in front of him as his smile widened even more. Javier looked into the doll's malevolent eyes and silently prayed that everything was a nightmare. But the terrifying reality didn't disappear. Then Marcus dropped the Barbie on Javier's defenseless body. The doll seemed to come to life. Its eyes lit up and its smile became even more sinister. The lights in the assembly hall flickered and dimmed briefly, and when they came back on, Javier had completely disappeared. The room was empty except for the Barbie, who was now standing on the stage, staring at the audience. A shiver ran down the spines of everyone present when the doll began to laugh, a laugh that resonated in the air like a disturbing echo. The temperature in the room began to drop drastically, and the doll grew in size until she reached the height of a child. The teachers and the students tried to flee in terror, but an invincible force kept them trapped in place. The Barbie, now giant, slowly approached the audience. When she finally reached one of the teachers, she grabbed him with her plastic hands and lifted him into the air. His squeals filled in the room. One by one, the doll trapped them all and subjected them to a terrible fate. The assembly hall was filled with chaos and horror, while Barbie's laughter echoed in the air. Only a couple of cleaning workers survived to tell what happened at that school. The doll and her terrible revenge remained a horror legend that tormented students for generations. A reminder that the unknown shouldn't be mocked. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!